Good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Gorell, and thank you for participating in today's 869th Justice Clearinghouse webinar, Building a Crime Gun Intelligence Capability. During our webinar today, Ray Gildetti will share details about the critical interorganizational elements that are necessary for advancing a robust crime gun intelligence capability capable of informing and influencing command decision makers and investigators in the field. Ray will discuss how to leverage cross-jurisdictional partnerships, harnessing law enforcement data sets to include NIBIN and eTrace, and enabling a jurisdiction's Fusion Center information sharing environment and analysis capability to foster communication, cooperation, and collaboration. Our presenter today is retired Lieutenant Colonel Ray Gildetti, who is the Principal Officer of G2 Innovations. His consultancy company provides thought leadership and strategic planning to assist government and private sector entities with advancing law enforcement, public safety, and security solutions. Ray retired from the New Jersey State Police, where he served as Deputy Superintendent of Investigations. Following his retirement, he worked for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms as a senior policy consultant, assisting the agency with advancing crime gun intelligence. Now, before we begin, I'd like to also extend a special thanks to our friends and partners at Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology for sponsoring this webinar. Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology is a leader in forensic analysis, providing innovative and effective solutions like its unique technology, the Integrated Ballistics Identification System, also known as IBIS. We truly appreciate working with organizations like Ultra, who are so committed to enhancing and growing our profession. Now, the last few things I'd like to address with everyone is some very special and critical housekeeping items. As mentioned in an email I sent out yesterday, this webinar has been pre-recorded, and for roughly the first 55 minutes, we'll be playing this pre-recorded session. You will only be able to hear the recording if you're connected to audio through your computer. Now, if you're connected to audio through a phone, you're going to hear me now, but the moment I start playing, you won't be able to hear anything. And I would invite you to copy the link in the chat and to watch the recording through our on-demand system. And again, I'll go ahead and copy that link there so that everyone can make sure that you have that. Now, our current plan involves Ray joining us once the video ends by phone to respond to any questions that you submit through the GoToWebinar toolbar. So please, as you watch the recording, go ahead and submit those questions just like you would in any other webinar. Finally, after today's session, there will be a follow-up survey, and we ask that you complete it. Your feedback helps shape everything we do here at Justice Clearinghouse. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hit play, and let me know if you have any questions.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the intro. You know, folks, it seems like yesterday when a former New Jersey Attorney General posed the question, how do you stop gun violence when it reaches the point that an innocent 13-year-old is gunned down while taking the trash out on Christmas Day? What I'll never forget is how he answered it. And he answered it straightforward. You do everything in your power, you marshal your forces, and you deploy them using a proven plan. I'll never forget that response. It's resonated with me. At the same time, it inspires me to do things like this today, to talk about a plan, talk about building capabilities to address gun violence. I retired from the state police. I was a deputy superintendent of investigations. And then I went on to work with ATF in advance of NIBIN. So I'm no stranger to the impact of gun violence. I was a former member of the National Crime Gun Intelligence Governance Board. I know the value of information on how it can be utilized to build capacities to better understand and suppress violence. So that said, in the next hour, I'd like to be able to discuss concepts that I believe you can put in place. Much of what we'll discuss today, I've written about, I've spoken about, and I've heard other folks speak about things in a very similar fashion. So I know that I'm not alone in these best practices. So let's get started here. I think we all agree that we have a problem. And what I mean by that is all we have to do is tune in to any news outlet today, and we can quickly come to the realization that murders, non-fatal shootings are on the rise drastically. It's a phenomenon that we haven't seen probably in decades. Some say it's an increase in the retaliatory nature of criminals, and if you combine that with medical technology, meaning that yesterday's victim is going to be tomorrow's shooter, I believe that is an impact. Or is it the drug trade? Is it COVID? Is it policies? Is it all the above? Regardless of the cause in this increase, there is a responsibility that we have as law enforcement, as society, to do everything we can, as a former Attorney General said, to figure out ways to stop the bloodshed, curtail the violence. So when it comes to law enforcement agencies across the nation, there's no one that's going to say that we should not be doing anything about gun violence. Yet, I think you know where I'm going with this comment here. In crisis like we are today as it relates to gun violence, there is a tremendous cost. And look, that cost is certainly associated with communities, the victims, but it's also cost to law enforcement organizations. There's going to be winners and losers. The winners, as the former Attorney General said, they will pull out all the stops to establish, tweak, reinvigorate their preventive, investigative capabilities to address gun crime. And unfortunately, there will be, and I hate to sound so terse, the losers, those entities, those agencies that may just want to maintain the status quo and deal with the scourge of gun crime, maybe through a reactionary lens. So I'm hoping that this presentation over the next hour or so, we could focus on the winning. We could focus on giving back to the communities, giving back the peace that they deserve. So with that said, since it's a big shout out here for NIBIN, I'm a huge fan of NIBIN, as I described in the introduction. So since 1999, the ATF has managed NIBIN. For those that don't know NIBIN, what it stands for, the National Integrated Ballistics Information Network. It has been an incredible and successful program that provides local, state, tribal, federal law enforcement partners with investigative leads through its automated ballistic imaging network. Now, what this really translates to, and has since its inception, is thousands upon thousands of investigative leads have been generated through the NIBIN program that reveal those hidden associations or connections among violent crimes and their perpetrators. Now, the Crime Gun Intelligence Governance Board, and I'm happy to say I was a part of that, a few years back promulgated guidance as it relates to how best to disrupt violent crime, or better said, how best to disrupt the vicious cycle of violence. And as you would guess, they certainly honed in or centered their guidance on NIBIN, on the 4 critical steps of NIBIN, certainly starting with comprehensive collection and entry of the ballistic imagery into NIBIN, utilizing solid policy and practice, but at the same time, recognizing that by doing this, by centering gun violence strategies on NIBIN, and understanding that there were going to be these hidden associations that were going to be revealed between violent crime events and the offenders, that we were going to be able to better curb gun violence. And then what I always like to say is bring peace to the communities. So NIBIN is critical to any gun violence strategy, whether it's for a single organization, whether it's in a local area, regional perspective, or even federal. But what we have learned from NIBIN is really important as we go forward in this presentation, and certainly as you go forward in building out those capacities within organizations or a collective of organizations to curb gun violence. And in a sense, we've learned that NIBIN is critical for gun violence strategies. It's vital for associating shooting events to shooting events, and we're going to go into that more shortly. And of course, shooting events to recovered firearms and suspects that may in fact, criminal suspects that may in fact be associated to those guns. NIBIN is a lead generator. So important because after all, what are police, what do they do, right? They respond to a crime and it's their job to investigate it. So leads are so critically important. And that's and hence what makes NIBIN so critical is that it allows for or provides leads that result in suppressing gun violence and of course solving crimes. Now, here's sort of like the double-edged sword here. The better you are at NIBIN, at processing those NIBIN images into leads, you're going to have a lot more leads to pursue. So that is a plus, but it certainly can be a bit challenging for many, many agencies. So at the most essential level, NIBIN provides us with two very, very important associations when you look at it through an investigative lens. And we're going to come back, or we're going to spend a little bit more time on that challenge that I just described in terms of when you get real good at processing NIBIN leads, the investigative leads that come out of it could be quite challenging, but that's a good problem to have. So hear me out on this. So NIBIN associations really come in two forms, and I'm boiling this down in that from a perspective of NIBIN associations, you have a shooting event to a recovered gun and a shooting event to a shooting event. Now, I'm trying to be sort of general as what's depicted on the screen of just really two types of associations. What's sort of missing here is that oftentimes we have multiple shooting events associated with one recovered gun, or multiple shooting events associated with multiple guns. So you can see how things start to spider web out. But just for our purposes here, I want to play out these two different types of scenarios. So the first one, while not always the case, NIBIN associations that depict a shooting hit to a shooting or to a recovered gun, that can often involve a suspect when that recovered gun, crime gun, was located on the person of someone. Now, I say not always the case because sometimes guns, crime guns, are abandoned, right? We know criminals get rid of their evidence sometimes. They get rid of their guns. They throw them off a bridge. They throw them or they hide them. They discard them. And law enforcement and the public sometimes comes in contact with them. Now, having a suspect to actually talk to about a crime that the gun that was in their possession was associated with, That's tremendous value to investigators. So imagine being able to speak to someone about a murder weapon that was found on their person. That's great stuff. And when you're an investigator and you're getting handed a NIBIN lead, you love those kind of leads, right? Now, the second type of NIBIN association is when a shooting event is associated with another shooting event. Now, often NIBIN will link, say, a homicide event to maybe separate shooting events, or even if it's not a homicide event, if multiple shooting events, with the gun still being out there in what I like to call the wild. Now, this type of association, this type of lead becomes a bit more challenging to investigate. Remember, if there's no recovered weapon, there's no means to get that trace information to really understand, who might have been involved with that gun. And with no possible suspects to talk to, you can see it gets a little bit challenging. Now, here's the, I would say, almost, when you're looking at these two types of associations, I was going to say here's the bad news, but here's the challenging news. And maybe you can guess. So out of the two types of NIBIN associations, which one do you think is more prevalent for law enforcement investigators to ultimately pursue? And I think you've guessed it, because it's never easy for law enforcement. It's the one that's harder to investigate and follow up upon. Meaning we see, and in my own experience, my experience talking to other SMEs in the field, is that you're going to see a lot more NIBIN associations of shooting event to shooting event. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One reason is once a gun is used, it's often involved in multiple shootings, right? So making matters worse is that these type of leads or these associations don't often occur in a vacuum. So if an agency is experiencing gun violence, then this is not the only lead that they're dealing with. So they just keep on coming, these type of associations. NIBIN is doing its job. It's providing these associations to us. It's providing this lead information to us. With that said, I'd like to sort of transition into a reason why it's so important to develop a crime gun intelligence capability that can assist us in not only investigating those shooting events that are associated with recovered guns, but also help ease the pain of when we're investigating shooting events to shooting events. So enter crime gun intelligence. What is crime gun intelligence? I think the best way for me to explain it is really to focus on NIBIN. So follow me here. NIBIN is the keystone for crime gun intelligence. Now, just for a moment, let's think back to when we learned about building and construction. What is a keystone? Well, it's the block that walks everything into position, right? It's that critical. Now, if we stick with that metaphor, let's also recognize that a robust crime gun intelligence capability also requires cornerstones. But look, we're sticking with that metaphor. So within that metaphor, what does a cornerstone do? It actually keeps things straight. So we could think of eTrace and what we're going to spend a lot more time in this presentation talking about is local information and intelligence. It's those cornerstones that help guide NIBIN. Now, further, at the most basic level, when cops investigate crimes, it really comes down for them to ask like those two important questions. What happened? And of course, who done it? So for this example here of understanding what crime gun intelligence is, if we look at NIBIN as understanding from a forensic and ballistic point of view, NIBIN answers that question of what happened, where eTrace, the information we pull from eTrace, and the information that we're able to garner from accessing those other cornerstones, they're going to access, or they're going to answer, I'm sorry, the question of who done it, who did this. So it's our job then to build a capacity, build that wall of a capability that's going to provide a greater capacity to answer those questions of what happened and who done it. That, at a fundamental level, is crime gun intelligence. Now, so what does crime gun intelligence provide us? Again, looking at this at a basic level, crime gun intelligence is about understanding your violent crime problem in your specific area of responsibility. And really good crime gun intelligence is being able to take action about once you understand those problems to better solve them. So crime gun intelligence is going to provide answers to questions. For instance, who the offenders are. Are they recidivist offenders? Were the offenders involved in shootings either before or after? Meaning, were they suspects at one time and then a victim, or vice versa? What was their motive? Is it retaliatory? Do they involve another crime? The gun, was it involved in multiple shootings? What is in the universe of guns that a AOR has knowledge of being involved in gun crime? Do we know what the time is between the shootings? We have studies out there that talk about being able to sort of forecast based on NIBIN information about when guns may be used again. So that gives us a sense of urgency. So having a robust crime gun intelligence capability is going to help answer these questions very quickly, so you can ready your finite resources to be able to better disrupt or prevent retaliatory shootings or shootings in general. Was your victim involved in other shootings? What do those other NIBIN associations look like? Does your victim have prior gun arrests? What does the NIBIN activity look like on those prior gun arrests? What does your suspect, or even your victim, what does warrants and what is their association with parole look like, and why is that important? How could we use this information to help us better solve crimes? Because the unfortunate aspect of gun crime is many of our victims, not all of them, but many of our victims are shooters themselves because of the retaliatory nature of gun crime. So this notion of being able to better understand gun crime really revolves around understanding context that can help us shape or I should say better understand our NIBIN information. So with that said, I want to just offer a very quick story as it relates to context and how context matters. And it's going to require you to have a little activity here because I'm going to ask you to engage in an experiment. Well, not really, but please bear with me here. So in 1990, Elizabeth Newton, she was a Stanford University graduate student of psychology. She conducted an experiment. There were two roles in the experiment. The first was the role of a tapper, and the second was a listener. Now, what this would mean was the tapper would actually tap out a song, and the listener was expected to guess that song. So just for a moment, I'm going to try it here for you. I'm going to tap out a song, and you try to guess it. Anyone guess that? That was actually Happy Birthday. So don't feel bad if you didn't get that right. If you did get that right, I definitely need to talk to you because over the course of that research experiment, there were 120 songs that were tapped out. Listeners only guessed 3 songs. So that was a success rate of under 3%, about 2.5%. So you see, without the other tonal accoutrements, listeners could only hear what you heard was a bizarre Morse code. So having gone through this experiment, I think you would agree that context matters. So let's go back to that NIBIN association that depicts shooting event to shooting event. And let's think of the amount of NIBIN associations that may come in like this, right? There's just, particularly if you're an agency that your shootings are multiple. And what does multiple mean? It really depends on the resources you have to investigate them. If it's just a team of 1 or 2 detectives, then 2 or 3 shooting incidents or NIBIN hits is going to be a lot. So this notion of information, or I should say investigative lead, the finite nature of investigators, that can get pretty dicey and challenging as these leads come in because nothing is done in a vacuum when you're experiencing gun violence. So let's ask ourselves about these associations. Which are far greater than the ones we suspect? Meaning this, that can we benefit from context? Can we benefit similar to what was experienced in that context experiment if we're able to add some contextual information like adding musical notes? Will we better understand through context the investigative leads that are being provided by NIBIN? And look, the answer is yes. Logically speaking, investigators focus on people, places, and things. That's what they're trained to do. That's how they tease out additional leads. That's how they can follow up on leads. So let's think of those items, people, places, and things as context. When we have immediate access to this contextual information, when we're faced with a NIBIN lead, shooting event to shooting event or shooting event to recovered firearm, we're in a much better place to sort of paint a picture. And the more shooting events we have, the more information that we're starting to pick up contextually that helps us learn more about the people, places, or things that are involved with this heinous crime. So with the right mindset and technology, now we can begin to put pieces together. And what I would also, in your mind's eye, think about is that just like when you're building a puzzle, as you put the pieces of the puzzle together, you might not have all the pieces in place before you begin to get a better understanding and picture of what the final puzzle will look like. And that's the same thing here with contextual information. If we're able to use that to buttress a NIBIN lead, we're in a much better place to understand or better see what the violent offender, maybe who they were, or where they lived, or what they were driving at the time. So let's take a closer look at local intelligence, or I should say local information for its contextual value to help bring our keystone of NIBIN to where it belongs at the forefront, right? In terms of a forefront of being able to leverage it as that investigative lead. So law enforcement organizations, I'm here to tell you, and you know this if you're in law enforcement, you are not starved by lack of information related to criminals. In fact, we often lose sight when you're in a law enforcement organization of the amount of investigative data sets that are generated day to day based on the just business transactions that take place in a law enforcement organization. But where law enforcement organizations always seem to be challenged in, and it's particularly a technology issue, is not being able to sort of aggregate and connect those data sets in a timely manner. So if you're facing a big gun violence problem, you need a big and bold apparatus, a big and bold mindset, and big and bold capabilities to be able to connect those shooting events to people, places, and things. By doing that, you're going to give investigators, that capabilities are going to give investigators a leg up in trying to, or I should say, pursuing investigative leads to suppress and prevent gun crime. Now, New Jersey has an incredible story that I will tell you continues to evolve, but it's useful for understanding what goes into developing the right capabilities to address gun violence. Now, of course, New Jersey's near and dear to my heart. That's where I spent my law enforcement career, and I was very much involved with not only the New Jersey State Police, but the New Jersey law enforcement community in building out a crime gun intelligence capability. Now, the story, the New Jersey story, really is underpinned by these three components that you see in front of you, which is cross-jurisdictional teamwork, policy-driven tactics, and leverage technology. Personally, I don't care the size of your organization, small, medium, or large, cross-jurisdictional teamwork is critically important. Why? Because gun crime is cross-jurisdictional. We know that, right? And even in some very, very large jurisdictions, large urban areas, cross-jurisdictional may in fact mean just across the city in terms of crossing precinct areas. So what the story that we're going to speak to, and I'll summarize it, it highlights that when we make little changes, we can have incredibly huge results, as it means what I'm speaking about is refining the ways we address teamwork, tactics, and technology in the face of gun violence. Now, this story begins around 2014. I will tell you, it's still going on today. The men and women there in New Jersey, not just in New Jersey State, but in New Jersey, are doing a hell of a job of constantly adding to and building out their crime gun intelligence capabilities. And that's something we'll talk about later, about the constant evolution. But this story began around 2014. It began when the Camden Metro Police in South Jersey provided what I would call constructive feedback on the turnaround times for the New Jersey State Police as it processed NIBIN leads. So at that time, our turnaround time was approximately 10 months. You see, our ballistic labs serviced probably about 60% or more of the state. And at the time, like most ballistic labs involved with NIBIN, particularly at the state level, maybe not at the city level, and there's a reason for that, is because at the state level, you may not necessarily be as close to the preventive means of what we're going to talk about shortly of NIBIN as it relates to investigative leads as you are of just processing guns that would come in to get ready for trial as requested by prosecutors. So while the ballistics lab was very much focused on the evidentiary side of the equation, which is really important, right? No one told them about the premonitory side of the equation of making sure that information that was teased out of NIBIN could be used in a preventive manner, could be used as intelligence to interdict, to stop retaliatory shootings. And that was a process that was in place for many years, and it was critical for serving the needs of cases that were going to trial. No one informed the lab that, look, you also got to do this other side. And to make matters worse, there were all sorts of choke points that were put in place for all the legitimate reasons that any law enforcement organization deals with. But those choke points actually curtailed the vital delivery of NIBIN information to those that needed it in the field immediately. Immediately. Remember, your 10-month turnaround. I'm excited to tell you, always happy to say, that once those ballistic folks, once they were brought into the loop on the value of NIBIN from a premonitory side, they were able to be able to be leveraged to provide leads out to investigate gun crime just after it was happening. So that 10-month turnaround time was then cut down to 24 to 36 hours. Now that's not bad considering that this state ballistics entity was processing guns throughout the state, which required agencies throughout the state to deliver their guns to the state police. So think about that. Go from 10 months down to, say, 36 hours. That's pretty good. So getting it right with the state police ballistics lab definitely changed things. However, however, what was quickly realized is that there is today, a multitude of NIBIN labs in the state of New Jersey, and that the nature of gun crime itself required that these labs, because of the cross-jurisdictional nature of gun crime, that these labs would have to share information with one another so they can better understand those associations. So while chapter 1 of our story focused on the state police ballistic lab changing their processes, or I should say adding to their processes, because they couldn't stop looking at the evidentiary end of bringing or focusing their expertise on supporting criminal trials, they also needed to focus their expertise on this premonitory. But just by them doing alone, that would not have sufficed in a state like New Jersey, that's similar to other states that do experience gun crime that crosses borders, local borders and county borders, and of course even state borders. So chapter 2 is all about, okay, how do we enable this cross-jurisdictional teamwork because of these handoffs and handshakes that are going to occur because of the nature of the crime. So returning to that notion that there's multiple labs in New Jersey, it was imperative that as entities were handing off evidence and information to one another, they were doing it in a similar fashion. They had to get on sort of that same page. And what that resulted in was this New Jersey ballistics community of interest that was born out of this notion of the handoffs and handshakes. They have to be speaking that same language and doing it under the tutelage as well of the ATF that very much engaged in the violent crime program in the state of New Jersey. And what this ballistics community of interest allowed for was, sharing of best practices, sharing information, right? And what was exciting about this was what came from it was standardization on how to deliver information to one another, and then how to deliver that information to the folks in the field that needed it to conduct investigations in a timely manner. That 10-month timeline was out the window. Now it was, how do we move to get that timeline much more compressed and follow the lead of entities like the Newark Police Ballistics Lab that was down to under 24 hours of pushing out leads. That was so critically important if we were going to stop this scourge, this retaliatory shooting. And how it would be shared among the labs and the countless investigators made us recognize that, wow, there are a lot of people that we're going to have to start engaging in terms of stakeholders. And I like to call them the food groups that are involved with violent crime and suppressing violent crime. And of course, the public is one of those stakeholders here. But with that said, while the forensic folks are tinkering with their processes so they can deliver NIBIN a lot quicker, and the other stakeholders, the investigators, the analysts, the commanders, the prosecutors, not only do they all have their own language, but they all have their own mission sets and, most importantly, their own goals and objectives when it comes to gun crime. And they often do not frequent each other's company on a day-to-day basis. In other words, these food groups aren't always at the water cooler or having lunch together so they can share information and ideas. So chapter 3 of this story, the New Jersey story, was about how do you bring these disparate groups together to address gun crime when in fact they don't necessarily always see each other and their goals are quite different. So this notion of a shared purpose of seeking justice for victims, resolution for the families, and peace for the communities, and I have to reference Pete Gagliardi for that notion of a shared purpose, not only to give him credit for it, but the importance of expressing that shared purpose to these diverse stakeholders is so critically important for them, so they're in a sense all on the same page while accomplishing their own missions. So this notion of turnover and brain drain is always a factor. Well, I'm here to tell you, I left the state of New Jersey, I left this larger community interest, and things are still moving and they're getting better than ever before because of tying tactics to policy and protocols. And interestingly enough, that has allowed for creativity and to watch how the forensic processes not only cut down the timeline from say 10 months to 36 or 24 hours, but to add enhanced process to it. So having protocols and policies actually allow for creativity. Now, I don't want to say that folks aren't allergic to change, because in law enforcement in general, there's two things that bother people. That's change and things that stay the same. So it was critically important during this time period, and I give a big shout out to Forensic Technologies and Pete Gagliardi for helping the state of New Jersey at the time conduct regional seminars to educate and sort of communicate what the vision was and what this and in doing so, partner up with the Attorney General's Advocacy Institute, partner up with the ATF SAC in New Jersey, county prosecutor what region you were at, other law enforcement leadership that was in the area. And that created not only an education and buy-in opportunities, but it planted the seed for champions, which are so important in developing crime gun intelligence capabilities. And today we see those champions carrying the torch on this. Really important. Now, instead of reinventing the wheel, as we look to distribute that NIBIN information with the contextual information, it was so important to leverage those existing information sharing initiatives that were out there in the state of New Jersey at the time, whether it was the Fusion Center or whether it was the forums that brought people together. Now, something like the Fusion Center was originally stood up because of terrorism, but it was but because of the capabilities that it developed as it related to information sharing in general, it's a great tool to be used to be able to push out information about violent crime. And from there, what was born from it were other initiatives related maybe more locally or regionally on how to assess violent crime and do something about those problems. Now, one thing that always challenged me when I was in command was technology. So, the old notion of that there's people, processes, and technology. That's what is going to allow entities to advance initiatives. We were always struggling with that right technology to be able to do just that. The exciting thing is, and it wasn't long ago in this slide deck that I talked about contextual information. Well, finally, there are opportunities to be able to layer and leverage technologies to assist with collection, analysis, and of course, the sharing of information related to suppressing violent crime. So today, that's happening in New Jersey. It allows them to better interpret the criminal environment, influence decision makers, and impact the criminal landscape. So relying on fact-based information or data sets, the investigators in New Jersey are now that much more precise in how they are targeting criminals. No longer should we expect investigators or uniform officers to head out to a hotspot location and just conduct enforcement operations or do jump outs for narcotic corners. Today, we have the means through a precision policing paradigm to leverage those data sets that are in the holdings of law enforcement that are focused on suspected criminals to be able to be that much more impactful for targeting the worst serial offenders who are impacting areas. And those are the same areas that we all agree need to have peace brought back to those communities. So by layering and leveraging technologies, entities that are facing this scourge of gun violence can better interpret the criminal landscape from not just the tactical environment or the technical dimension, but operationally and strategically. What do I mean by that? So tactically, to be able to use this information, this suspected criminal information to turn those levers of vulnerability on a criminal offender, a suspect, so we can be able to tease out those people, places, and things, and be able to use that, whether it's use it against a criminal offender or help us to identify criminal offenders. Operationally, how entities can leverage technology so they can not only better understand the hotspot areas, but then decipher those patterns of crime so they can better mobilize their finite resources. And then, of course, strategically, being armed with information about the criminal environment that could not only inform resource allocation and training, but future policy development or review of existing policies as well. Law enforcement has that information now that they could incorporate those data sets, and then in the aggregate to help them out tactically, operationally, and certainly strategically as well. So what we learned from the New Jersey story is that if we can make minor adjustments across the law enforcement community via policy processes and people, we're in a better position to understand gun violence and then develop strategies or operations to suppress it. We also learned that advancing crime gun intelligence requires champions in different disciplines. And it's just as important that we recognize that leaders need to listen to champions so they can advocate for crime gun intelligence programs and make sure they're resourced appropriately, not only with analysts and investigators, but technology and, of course, leadership to constantly review this. And lastly, we learned that we went through sort of steps, sort of chronologically. I was summarizing it for you, so I didn't want to spend too much time going almost year to year, but there were steps that New Jersey went through to develop this robust crime gun intelligence program. The nature of this type of crime requires that no step be skipped. I will tell you, it starts with making sure that we're following those 4 steps for NIBIN, right? That's number one. But then as we mature organizationally or cross-jurisdictionally, there are those other components that need to be added in. No step can be skipped. And at the same time, you're not necessarily, because of the cross-jurisdictional nature of gun crime, you may not go from step A to step Z as quickly as you may like. It may take some time. But the overarching lesson that we learned is that NIBIN is the keystone for crime gun intelligence, but it can only be realized to its fullest potential if we have a mechanism on being able to access that contextual data that law enforcement has in their holdings so we could better energize NIBIN and we're getting so many NIBIN leads. The NIBIN program is fantastic at what it does. What can we do to add to that? Whether that's through policies, practices, and technology, they're all available to us. Let's be creative in doing that so we could tackle gun crime. So what I've spelled out for you is that we have the ability to get really good at catching shooters and removing them from the streets. We have the capacity to prevent future crimes, take guns off the street before 13-year-olds are shot, or even before 13-year-olds get their hands on guns themselves. This requires effort. I'm going to remind you that our job is, again, I like emphasizing this, is to bring justice to the victims, resolution to their families, and continued peace to communities. We can do this. We can combat gun crime. We can build impactful crime gun intelligence capabilities, but it starts with us not only ensuring that our NIBIN capabilities are where they should be, and at the same time looking at those other cornerstones, eTrace and local information and intelligence. We have the bricks, we have the mortar, we have the tools to build out a robust crime gun intelligence capability that can save lives and certainly prevent the bloodshed. So I appreciate you taking the time with me today to speak about crime gun intelligence, and I look to speaking further with you in the future.
All right, folks, and thank you so much for hanging in there with us. Really appreciate it. I know that we have both Ray and Jim Needles on the line with us. Before we go to that, I just want to let you know, if you have questions for either Ray or Jim, please type them in through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll address as many of those as possible over the roughly next 15 minutes or so. Likewise, if you have any interest in being able to try to get a hold of Jim or Ray, feel free to email me, Aaron@justiceclearinghouse.com, and I'm happy to connect you to. Now, I also want to let you know that the next webinar with Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology is scheduled for November 3rd, when former U.S. Attorney Bob Troyer will present on maximizing NIBIN's potential in the courtroom. And again, that webinar is on November 3rd. And if that sounds like something that's interesting to you, go to the Justice Clearinghouse website, click on webinar schedule, and you should find that event on November 3rd. All right, and Jim, Ray, if you guys are ready, I'd love to start working our way through these questions.
Aaron, this is Ray, and I'm ready.
Fantastic. First question is from Deborah. Deborah asks, can you talk about collecting data and providing appropriate follow-up on shots fired incidents? It seems many agencies do a poor job of analysis, and what are your thoughts?
Was the question aimed at shots fired data? Is that what she described? Can you read that one more time?
It is. Yeah, it sounds like it's specific to following up on shots fired incidents.
So what I would ask Deborah is there a capacity within, say, a real-time crime center or a fusion center that actually is collecting that data? Is it acoustic gunfire detection data? That shooting information, or so say shooting data, can come in different formats, and depending on what that format is how best it can be analyzed. Obviously, more is better. We know that gunfire detection is an awesome tool to be able to pick up on gunfire or shots fired itself, but to be able to piggyback that off and be supplemented against information that was maybe specific to the responding frontline officers, what information they may have picked up. So the more information, the better, but without knowing exactly what data set she's talking about, it's hard to describe sort of like what angle she may want to proceed.
Absolutely, certainly understand that. Next question is from Monica. Monica would like to know, what key performance metrics do you suggest be tracked to help assess Cgix?
Key performance metrics for Cgix. So what we've described early on within this presentation was, let's look first at what is the processing time for ballistic evidence that's recovered in terms of through NIBIN. That's the first step, okay? That's a metric there. But then as that program grows out and as capabilities become much more mature, and I think this was laid out in the presentation, that's not going to be enough. So what we want to then do is to be able to develop metrics, and it's going to be customized to a particular jurisdiction on how it relates to how these, we'll reference them as NIBIN leads, how are they actioned out? And what is the metrics that is acceptable to that jurisdiction in terms of how those NIBIN leads are actioned out? And then once that metric is developed, well, we then want to move to a third phase on what does this look like in terms of turnaround on a NIBIN lead investigation or a shooting investigation? What does that metric look like in terms of not only addressing the shooting hit investigation, but how is it, what does it look like to be closed or pending? What do those metrics look like? And again, this has to be customized to a particular jurisdiction or Cgix because of capabilities, personal resources, technology that might be available. The bottom line is, and this is always difficult in law enforcement, is that we don't always just want to focus on the outputs. It's very easy for us in law enforcement to do that. The old adage is like, don't focus on arrests, let's focus on what those outcomes are in terms of what's happening in the criminal environment in terms of suppressing crime. The same holds true as it relates to developing a crime gun intelligence capability. On the front end, we want to be able to focus on those outputs because we're just starting, and the outputs being what's happening with processing NIBIN leads. You know, secondly, what does it look like for us actioning out cases? But what we all want to strive for is the ends here in terms of what are we doing to the criminal environment? How are we suppressing crime? How are we dropping crime? How are we able to focus our attention on a hotspot area and be able to address that, whether we're going to address it through prevention, interdiction, or arrest.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ray. Okay, next question is from Christopher. Did your broader gun intelligence group have an SOP manual for the handling within the organization?
So what was interesting about the entity that I described in New Jersey, it was at the state level. So there was a collective of different entities, not only from a ballistic processing, but also investigatively. So I could speak for certainly the New Jersey State Police in their ballistic capability. Yes, there was not only existing protocols on processing, but then protocols, policies as it relates to the processing of ballistic evidence. Now, very fortunate in New Jersey where all this was mapped back to law, state legislation that speaks to processing crime guns, not only from a NIBIN side of the house, but also from the trace side of the house, and then also following up on these ballistic leads. But that, as we like to describe, is that it's the policies that are going to sustain your program into the future. Of course, we always need leaders to be able to not only action out those policies, but then follow up on them.
Fantastic. Okay, next question is from Mallory. Can you further explain the feedback loop and what that looks like in an already established crime gun intelligence program?
The feedback loop in an already established crime gun intelligence program?
Correct.
Again, what I have found is, depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the agencies that are heading up those Cgix, okay, I mean, you have formalized Cgix that are represented by the ATF. You have Cgix, and I'd say lowercase lettering, where you have folks in real-time crime centers and fusion centers that are processing information, turning it to actionable intelligence. That feedback loop has to come in a variety of formats. Not only does it have to come in the format as it relates to when information's going out, what is actually coming back to the Cgix to understand how the field is processing, or did they receive that information. But it also has to take place in other formats as well. I was very fortunate in New Jersey to see this take shape, and now what they're doing is exceptional, where they have collectives of entities, that law enforcement entities that represent those food groups that were described in the presentation, that come together, whether it's at a municipal level, whether it's at a regional level, or whether it's at the state level. And in New Jersey, there was names for these type of collectives and these information sharing platforms where people physically are in the same room, face to face. They're exchanging information. You have folks briefing out, analysts, investigators briefing out on information developed through a crime gun intelligence program, and they're speaking directly to those decision makers in the field or commanders, and they're having an exchange. That exchange happening in real time is providing that feedback loop. Now, that's at certainly the operational level. What is always important in any program, regardless of its crime gun intelligence or other law enforcement crime reduction programs, is a formal feedback loop as well, where folks can get together maybe on a quarterly basis, maybe a semi-annual basis, to actually bring people together, maybe sort of in a Delphi method, to bring people together and exchange information about what's going well and what needs to be looked at, that feedback level. So hopefully I described it where you're developing feedback mechanisms that are not only at the tactical level, and that was what I said earlier, where information is going out, making sure people are receiving it. And secondly, at the operational level, is having those, face-to-face discussion where you have your analysts being able to brief directly to decision makers and let decision makers provide feedback directly. And then thirdly is at the strategic level, bringing folks in to assess the program writ large as a whole, and be able to, from that feedback, make the necessary changes. There's no cookie cutter solution to this. There's no template to this. I really wish there was, but because of the way law enforcement is structured within the United States, it'd be difficult to do that. Each of these entities, these crime gun intelligence capabilities, whether it's at the local level, the regional level, or at the state level, are going to be slightly different based on resourcing, based on technology, and based on a host of other things that may find its way into this jurisdiction, and that may very well be law and policy.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ray. All right, we got about 3 more questions here. Next question is from Carlton. Within the Caribbean, we have NIBIN situated in Barbados. The issue that we have is that we have to send samples to that country. Sometimes all of the ballistic information is not sent to Barbados because the accused may plead guilty. Should we send the samples even if there was a conviction?
I don't necessarily understand that question, and Jim, maybe you can lean in on that since you've worked with the federal government on this.
Sure, Ray. Yes, definitely that information should be sent and should be entered into the system. You don't know what you might find that it may connect to. It may connect to crimes unknown to you and unknown to the investigators or prosecutors from the particular crime you're talking about. So I would say absolutely that information should be collected and entered into the system.
Thank you so much, Jim. Christopher asks, what information systems did you use in New Jersey to collect the information and disseminate it to the various partners?
New Jersey, it was a unique animal in a sense that while this was going on in terms of the building out of a crime gun intelligence program, and what I'd like to make sure I emphasize is that this is dynamic. There's an evolution to what is happening in New Jersey and what I've seen happening in other successful entities across the country. It's not that you build it and it's over. You're constantly evolving. Just recently, I was talking to someone from what I call the New Jersey story, and how they were explaining to me what is going on today is light years ahead of where they were at 3 to 5 years ago. And 3 to 5 years ago, they were doing a hell of a job in terms of how they were collecting, processing, and sharing information. But because of not only the experience level of the folks involved on the ground doing this, but also because of technology, they're constantly refining the way they do things and, flattening out that the learning curve for folks that may just be starting out in this realm, because there's always a big turnover in law enforcement, and also, compressing the timeline for things. What was unique and continues to be unique about, say, an entity like New Jersey and those entities within New Jersey from the different levels, whether it's at the federal, state, and local level, is they have information sharing apparatus that they've leveraged. The Fusion Center, it's a statewide Fusion Center, okay? That was originally stood up to address terrorism, and then wasn't long after that center was also focusing on crime. And then in the last 10 to 15 years, how the Fusion Center has shifted its focus depending on what was happening topically, right, to address the crisis. Right now, it's been pandemic besides violent crime. But my point is to be able to leverage those apparatus that are in a Fusion Center and real-time crime centers to not only assist with collecting information, processing it, analyzing it, and then sharing it. That has been the secret sauce in New Jersey that has been able to support not only the current status, but the evolution going forward.
Brilliant. Okay, the last question is from Stephen. Jim, this one might be right up your alley. Stephen would like to know, is there a standard time duration for case turnaround time? How long should a case spend in a firearms laboratory if all required exhibits have been provided? And of course, Ray, if you'd like to answer this one as well.
So this is Jim. Timeliness is a key to successful firearm strategy. The quicker you can get this information from the time that cartridge case hits the cement till the time an investigator has a lead is generated for that investigator, and that information is back to that investigator, is crucial to continue the investigation. So is there a time frame? We shoot for 24 hours. If we can get it done in that time frame, that's great. Other agencies right now are shooting for less than that. They're shooting to have that turnaround time in just hours to get that information back to investigators. So timeliness is a crucial part of a firearm strategy. And when setting up your firearm strategy, your processes need to be cognizant of that. When setting up your processes, you want to have timeliness in mind, and how are we going to get this information to the investigators as quickly as possible. And once we get the information to the investigators, then we can break that chain of violence and prevent the next shooting.
And Aaron, what I would sort of add to that, not from how Jim answered it, to me, I am a huge supporter of timeliness. It's so critical in terms of being able to get information out to the field as fast as possible, but also recognize that since timeliness is so important, that, and I hope I conveyed this during the presentation and sort of even speaking to it now, is that there is no shortcut to any of this. You cannot just flip a switch and say, okay, we're processing NIBIN leads now, and we don't really have to pay attention to this anymore. There is a constant evolution that has to take place that starts with getting it right with those elements of a successful NIBIN program. But with that requires champions and leaders to look at that. How do we, as Jim said, how do we constantly just flatten that time it takes to process these leads? Because there's other things that have to be done through the investigative process. It's just not the NIBIN turnaround. Now it's requiring, particularly in agencies that are, suffering from frequency in gun violence, to be able to process that information against other NIBIN leads, against other contextual information in the criminal environment, then be able to take that information and make it actionable to the investigators in the field, and so the investigators can do their work. We want to get this done as fast as possible, because not only do we want to catch a shooter, but more importantly, we want to prevent a shooter, the next shooting. And I'll just end with this. If there's shell casings that are found in the street near a stop sign, okay, maybe in years past we'd overlook that because was there really property damage? Was there anyone hurt? Well, now we all recognize that those are potential leads. And the faster that we can process that information, the better enabled we're going to be to prevent the next shooting, or stop the next shooting, or even arrest those serial shooters. We can only do that with a quick turnaround on the NIBIN front end, so it puts everything into gear that has to follow the NIBIN processing. So speed matters here.
Jim, Ray, thank you both so much for joining us for the Q&A portion of this webinar, and thank you to our audience for joining us as well today. If you have any questions, I am happy to take those and forward it to Jim and Ray. Again, my email is Aaron, AARON, @justiceclearinghouse.com. And with that, this concludes this morning's Justice Clearinghouse webinar. Take care, everyone, and please stay safe. Bye now.